Hello there. I think everything's working. Just double check. It's exciting to see we've got 65 people already. I'm very pleased about that, especially because I every now and again do one of these pop-up seminars and I literally just give 2 hours notice, jump on, do it and leave. Why do I do that? Well, I'll tell you a little bit of the background as to why I wanted to talk about this subject today, and that'll give time for more people to join us. Mind you, somehow we went straight from 65 to 35, so I don't know if the number's accurate on YouTube. So sometimes with the pop-ups, if somebody asks me a really good question about something, and I don't want to wait for the Paro seminar. So as many of you know, I give monthly seminars and I also do reading groups and courses. But if there's a great question comes up and I'm not doing a seminar for a while, then I'll just go online and talk straight away. And I've got the next 3 months of Paro seminars all planned out. So I wasn't going to wait 4 months to talk about the subject, hence the pop-up. And it is my desire to keep doing these. I mean, I think I do them about 3 or 4 times a year. I think I would like to kind of up the amount, maybe even doing it once a week at some point and become a bit of a YouTuber. But I don't know if I have the skills for that. I see people are starting to say hello. David, Heather Lynn, hello. Stephen, Andy. There's quite a few people I know here watching this. That makes me even more nervous because I'm tackling kind of like obviously a very difficult subject, and so I kind of do that in fear and trembling. Basically, deal is, if you're watching this live, use the chat box to chat, to make comments, to do all of that stuff. If you have a question for me, all you have to do is write question in capital letters so that I see it. If you forget, it's fine, I might see it, but that will make me see it, or even just Q, because there's a limited number of characters, so that takes up quite a few characters. Questions, so Q or question or look at this, you idiot, or anything in caps. I'm going to see at the beginning, and then you can ask your question. You don't need to write your question in caps because that would be like shouting, but you can shout question, and you're welcome to shout your question as well. So that's that. So after I've talked, I'll just have a little look at the chat and hopefully be able to kind of pick some of the questions. As I was saying there, the reason for doing this was I had a question on my Patreon from Elizabeth Marino, who's an anthropologist, and she was commenting on a talk that I gave last month. And I thought it was a really, really good question, a really good comment. And it was about how do we listen to the other? Whether the other is homeless or the other is some sort of kind of racist group or whatever, how do we listen to the other and how do we engage with otherness? And so I thought that question inspired me, so I'm going to do this seminar. I'm going to come back to her question in the second half of this talk. But first of all, I want to say that this talk is kind of being triangulated in relation to 2 others that I've given recently. One is called Social Distortions. That's on my YouTube page, so you can have a little look at that if you want. And the first half of my talk is going to come off the conclusions of that talk, but I'll also summarize that now for you. And then the other is called From Enemy to Neighbor. And that's currently not on my YouTube channel, but I will put it up on my YouTube channel after this talk. It's private on my Patreon at the moment, but I can't reference a talk. It's not fair if I don't make it free for you as well. So those are the 2 talks that I'm kind of primarily bouncing off in relation to today, and this idea of how do we understand the discourse around racism in contemporary society. Okay, so I'm going to start off with that first talk, Social Distortions. And basically what I did is I took a seminal essay by the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss called Do Duel Organizations Exist, which you can find in, I think it's volume 2 of Structural Anthropology. It might be volume 1, but I'm pretty sure it's volume 2. And this is an essay that Lacan references, and it's also one that Zizek has written very brilliantly on as well. And I just want to summarize what Lévi-Strauss is arguing in that essay, and then take it from there. So basically, Lévi-Strauss asks this question, do dual organizations exist? And what he basically means by that is, are there societies in which there are two ways of mapping social reality that kind of fit together, right? So like yin and yang, right? Like that two ways of mapping reality that are different, they're contrasting, but they kind of like say they fit together like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And Lévi-Strauss basically argues that this is highly unlikely, that although anthropologists at times have talked about dual organizations, they don't actually exist. And so what he does is he looks at one group, one society, and he notices that one moiety, one group within that society, draws the map of the village in one way, and the other moiety draws the map of the village in a different way. So it's the same village, but it's mapped in two different ways. So one group draw a circle which represents the village, and then another smaller circle within that, which represents the temple, the sacred place. And outside the wider circle is the forest, is untamed land. Inside the circle is residential life and cultivated land. And then in the center is the temple around which everything revolves. Then the other group draw a circle, but they draw a line down the middle. And on one side of the line, there's one group, one moiety, and the other side of the line there is another, kind of the upper and lower class, right? And so Lévi-Strauss notices this. He thinks this is fascinating. Going like, depending on who you ask, the map of social reality looks different. And then he says the common ways of trying to fix this. One of the common ways is, of course, to say, well, one of them's right and one of them's wrong, right? So which one's correct? The other way would be to say, well, you could say they're both wrong, and try to find a third way of mapping, which actually is a way of saying that they both can be consumed within some sort of larger map. Almost like if you took a photograph of the village from the sky, you would get the objective layout, and then you could map on these two different opposing groups. But Lévi-Strauss, he rejects both of these and says that there isn't some way of unifying these. There's not some way of containing them in a larger symbolic narrative. They are incommensurable worlds. And this is very interesting because this means that it's not that a given society has a similar world, right? We all share a similar world and we all kind of have a similar view of it. And then some of us are on one side and some of us are on the other. And then we can argue and fight. But rather that different groups within society map the world completely different. They basically inhabit entirely different worlds. And so therefore, you think you're talking to the other person, but you're literally talking past them. There's an incommensurability. Now, in the talk that I gave, I go into this notion of the real. In psychoanalysis and in philosophy, the real could be named as the antagonism that generates the different ways of narrating or symbolizing social life, right? So there is some sort of underlying antagonism or conflict, and there is some sort of underlying fundamental fantasy that generates these two very different ways of seeing the world. And the real is kind of that. The real isn't the true map, but rather what prevents us from having a true map, what prevents something from being at one with itself. And I've used the example before, but in Northern Ireland, we have a city that is called Slash City. Well, they call it Stroke City. And it's called Stroke City because it's got two names. The city is either called Derry or Londonderry, depending on which side of the conflict you grew up on, whether you're a nationalist or a loyalist, right? Whether you're Catholic or Protestant, right? So if you're a loyalist, you would tend to call it Londonderry, and if you're a nationalist, you would call it Derry. And of course, there's no in between, right? You're stuck. So if it was always a way of telling what side of the community you were on. Somebody might ask you to name the city, and you'd be terrified because if you name it incorrectly, the people asking you might beat you up. So eventually, in the media, it was called Derry stroke Londonderry. And then there was a radio presenter who called it Stroke City, right? So they became kind of known colloquially as Stroke City. But that's kind of like, there's one city, Derry stroke Londonderry, but it's mapped in two radically different ways, depending on which community you're part of. Okay, so what has that got to do with discourse around kind of race in America? So one of the things that's difficult is that people are talking past each other all the time, and then it generates a whole, I think I mentioned it in the description, this cottage industry of people making YouTube videos mocking the other side and owning, in inverted commas, the other side. So it produces something, but it's mostly hot air. Now, one way of beginning to maybe understand the why it's so messy, I'm going to draw a kind of matrix in our heads. I'm not going to literally draw it. I should have PowerPoint or something. But if you could imagine 3 columns, I'm not going to talk about these columns because this is very well known, but 3 columns, and we'll call the first column prejudice, the second column power, the third column prejudice and power, right? So sometimes when people are talking about racism, they're talking about prejudice. So they're talking about subjective prejudice against a group. And then sometimes when people are talking about racism, they're talking about power, which means that you don't have to subjectively be prejudiced against a group, but you're participating in some sort of structure that effectively discriminates materially against a certain group. And then you have power and prejudice. Some people say that, it's racism is both, right? It's kind of a bit of a mix of both. So those are your columns. And, once you start to kind of like identify who's talking about what, it kind of clears things up a little bit. But the one that's less known is the difference between the racism of supremacy and the racism of Orientalism. So supremacy is where the prejudice is against another group. Another group is magical, special, undivided. And Orientalism, your group, supremacy is when your group is undivided, when your group is magical, is better. And Orientalism is when the other group is magical and special and undivided, right? And you can begin again to see, and I'm not going to use any contemporary examples because it's too emotive, but you can begin to see that, yes, some people are talking about supremacy when they're talking about racism. Some people are talking about Orientalism when they're talking about racism. Now, the question is, how does supremacy and Orientalism, how do they interact with each other, right? Are they a dual organization, right? Is the perfect society for racists one in which some of them are supremacists and some of them are Orientalists, right? That would be the kind of common sense kind of notion, is that these are like yin and yang. They're opposites that speak the same language, right? But in terms of the notion that dual organizations don't exist, then you have to go, okay, right, supremacy and Orientalism have to have a more complex, incommensurable relationship with each other. So what does that look like? So to know what that looks like, we have to move from S and O to S and M, right? Sadism and Masochism, right? Supremacy kind of can be seen as a form of kind of masochism, supremacy is a form of sadism, and Orientalism a form of masochism. So at a political level, this supremacist is, in popular sense, enjoying the suffering of the other. They are undivided and they are causing the suffering of the other. And the Orientalist is the one who's getting pleasure out of seeing the other as undivided and themselves as divided and responsible and wrong. Right? But the interesting thing is, sadism and masochism are not, again, they're not a dual organization. So let's kind of dissect this a little bit more, right? If a sadist was just interested in causing suffering, so we talk about a psychotic sadist, right? They're just interested in the suffering of the other. That wouldn't work, right? The sadist and the masochist are involved because the sadist enjoys the pleasure of the masochist, the pleasurable suffering of the masochist. That's why the old thing of like the ultimate punishment for the sadist against the masochist is to stop playing altogether, to stop the relationship, right? But that wouldn't work, right? If the sadist says to the masochist, yeah, right, what can I do that you really, really won't like? Well, I'm not going to cause you any suffering. I'm not going to play the game. But that completely breaks the link between sadism and masochism. Or you can say a masochist says, you can do anything to me, and then the sadist says, okay, I'm going to cut off your hand. And the masochist suddenly backs off, right? So then the fantasy frame is broken, right? So you can already begin to see that sadism and masochism have a very, very subtle dance. And the masochist has a lot of power. The masochist is the one who is often negotiating what is a painful pleasure and what is just painful, what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And that kind of negotiation is happening, throughout, right? So the perverse structure, so sadism and masochism are part of a perverse structure. I'm not talking about, say, a psychotic sadism, but a perverse sadism and a perverse masochism are incommensurable. It's not that the sadist is just taking pleasure from the suffering of the masochist and the masochist is just enjoying the suffering. The sadist is enjoying the painful pleasure that they're generating in the masochist, and the masochist is enjoying the pleasure that they're generating in the sadist. And there's this kind of interconnectivity. So what is the underlying antagonism or the fundamental fantasy that unifies the masochist and the sadist? And one way of thinking about it is that it's all about there being an undivided other, and that undivided other is maintained precisely through prohibition, through a not having sexual gratification, or through not having pleasure, or through a type of confinement or suffering. So you see, both of them are occupying different places in a fundamental fantasy of an undivided other, a divided other, fundamentally divided other, and a prohibition that prevents these two coming together, and an enjoyment precisely of the prohibition itself. Right? And so that means that fundamental to sadism and masochism is the generation of anxiety. Right? The lack of one person has to be exacerbated, has to be inflamed, has to be brought out, has to become a thing, has to become almost like a substance. The lack has to take a shape through this, as I say, this antagonistic generation of an anxiety builds up, and is not fulfilled. And as that lack is felt, so is the feeling of some other who's undivided, who can fill that lack, who can satisfy it. But that fantasy is only maintained through the impossibility. And there's an element of this in all sexual desire, right? Sex kind of ends with the orgasm, right? With the pleasure, like all the enjoyment is in the foreplay leading up to that, and then it kind of ends, the little death, right? And so there's an anxiety generated in both parties. The sadist needs the masochist in order to feel undivided, right? They feel divided. The masochist generates their anxiety and gets it to a point where then they can feel this sense of being undivided. And the sadist generates the anxiety in the masochist. So this generation of anxiety and lack, and then a not fulfillment of the lack, and then a pleasure precisely in the lack of fulfillment itself, right? Which is obviously, maybe not obviously, but then the central ideology of today, right? Because if in contemporary economic life, there is always the promise of an undivided other, something, some commodity satisfaction, some psychedelic enlightenment, some sexual experience that can allow for a sense of wholeness and completeness. which is only ever kept alive through not getting it, through its impossibility, then there's society generates a perverse structure, right? There's a perverse ideology at work today, and that perverse ideology primarily manifests itself as Orientalism within kind of like obviously within corporate America, obviously within the entertainment industry, government, and also supremacy within other areas of the government and maybe in kind of more kind of working class environments. So these two elements are interconnected. They do fuel each other. One's just in kind of a more dominant position today, but they both feed on each other. They both rely on the same underlying fundamental fantasy. And both of them are failures, right? That's why they can never be overcome. They will always keep returning. And what is the failure? The failure is the inability to integrate lack and enjoy lack, right? To integrate, to enjoy, and to overcome that lack. So the perverse individual, in a way, is always repeating either their own self-division or the other's self-division in order to maintain a certain pleasure. And the way to address that fundamental fantasy is to somehow see that we are all divided, right? That's why for someone like Edward Said, who kind of coins the term Orientalism, Orientalism is also a form of superiority. So it's not, again, dual organization, that supremacy is we think we're the best, and Orientalism, we think they're the best, right? Orientalism is a form of kind of perverse supremacy, because the Orientalist says we are responsible for everything, right? We are responsible for all the terrible things that have happened in the world. We are responsible for the terrible things that are happening in another country, etc., etc. Now, the reason why that's a form of superiority is because to be evil, you have to be ethical, right? You have to rise to the level of ethics in order to be able to do things that are wrong, right? Whenever you treat another group as being special, magical, more close to nature, all of those kind of like notions, what you do is you basically are treating them like a child or like an animal that hasn't yet reached the age of being able to themselves be a moral character who is able to do evil. And that's why a lot of the critiques of Orientalism are people saying, no, don't take all the responsibility onto yourself and treat me like a child. You know, I'm responsible for my own issues. You know, because taking that responsibility on to be unethical or ethical, both place yourself in a higher space. You're more human. You're more kind of like you're risen to the level of a free agent, whereas these others are purely pawns that either relate to you being brilliant, like this group of people would be nothing without us. We can come in here and we can show them how to do everything, right? Or we are responsible for everything because this group don't even rise to the level of being able to take any responsibility. So there is within Orientalism, and this is what Edward Said brings out, is weirdly, it is just as superior, just in this interestingly perverse kind of way. Okay, and I don't know if I've kind of driven the point home enough that this is the ideological position today. In that ideology, in a nutshell, is any system that covers over the lack, that avoids a confrontation with self-division, with the division of reality. And so ideology is always attempting to cover that over. There's a great lecture by Todd McGowan on his YouTube channel. I recommend you watch it, on ideology, and he goes through kind of how ideology as a term develops over time. There's also a good book by Terry Eagleton on ideology as well. There's lots of good stuff out there, but those are two very good ones. But Todd McGowan, talks about how ideology attempts to maintain the idea that there is no fundamental division in society. There's only a contingent one, right? There's a group that if we could get rid of, everything would be great. There's the division that's part of existence called the lack is made into a contingent loss. something that can be gained back, something that is not necessary, something that is not woven into the nature of reality, something that is not ontological. And that loss, that lack is made into loss, and that loss is put onto someone else that we can then cut out like a cancer. Now this brings me to the second talk, right? The second talk I gave more recently, which was called From Enemy to Neighbour, develops this idea that basically what we have politically is we have the categories of friend and enemy. A friend is someone who is close, an enemy is someone who is distant. A friend is someone who is safe, an enemy is dangerous, right? A friend is within, an enemy is without, right? So we've got these distinctions, and the political theorist Carl Schmitt basically talks about how politics is managing these categories of friend and enemy. The category of neighbour is different. A neighbour is not a friend or an enemy. There are neighbours who are closer to friends, and there are neighbours who are closer to enemies. But the difference is an enemy is someone that you can cut out of society, you can kill and destroy. A neighbour is someone that you occupy the same social space as. They are toxic. They're another whose music's too loud, who kind of impinges on your life and your rights, who can be very, very annoying, but you have to live with, right? They're part of society. You can't just get rid of them like the enemy. The category of the neighbour then is more true than the enemy. Scapegoating is when you take the lack, make it into a loss, put it onto some other group. That's a scapegoating mechanism. Whenever you realize that your enemy is actually part of the same social structure that you're part of and exists because of that social structure, the enemy then becomes a neighbour who you have to tarry with. Now, the point of this is a neighbour is not someone who, is a friend. Oh, the enemy is just someone whose story I haven't heard, right? That actually once we all get to know each other, we'll all have like a hippie commune and all get on well, right? No, the neighbour is someone you precisely don't like, someone who's potentially someone who is weird and other and strange. But what I did in the last talk, and say, go have a look at it, I'm just summarising, is looking at how the monstrosity of the neighbour is actually scary to us because the neighbour ultimately reveals our own monstrosity to ourselves, that we are other to ourselves. At first we think the neighbour is weird, but then we see ourselves through the neighbour's eyes and we realise that we're a bit weird. Our political, cultural and religious views are strange. The other decenters us. And so when you engage with the neighbour, you're kind of engaging in this kind of like very difficult conflictual environment. Now that brings me to the question Elizabeth asked and the comment she made to me where she said, well, because I used the example of the homeless where I said, like, if you look at the homeless in a given society, I worked for a homeless organisation for a while called the Simon Community. So in Northern Ireland, you've got this homeless population. And the idea is not simply that we are good news to the homeless, that we go out to help the homeless. But with this idea, you go, no, the homeless are good news to us. There is something about our society that generates this problem. Some societies have terrible problems with homelessness and others hardly at all, right? So there's something structurally about some societies that generate this homelessness situation. So homelessness is not the problem, it's the solution to a problem that is within the society. So we have to listen to the homeless to try to figure out what it is about the society that I'm part of that means some of my neighbours are homeless. So it's not just about giving a blanket to somebody, it's about going, okay, they are my neighbour, we share the same social space, so they become good news to me because they help me to potentially see the problems within the system that I inhabit. So the question was, well, how do we listen to the other? Because it's different, so a fascist group is different from from homeless group, right? How do we listen to, say, fascists? Are we supposed to listen to them because of some otherness and because we share social space with them? And the answer for me is yes, 100%. But there's a difference in that I'm not advocating listening to individual homeless people, right? There's a real need for that. Therapists can do that, and actually in the work in the Simon community, that's what we did, right? So that's different, but I'm not talking about that structurally. It's not, because if you talk to individual homeless people, you will find some traumatic human stories, you will find some psychotic delusions. You'll find health issues, different things, right? So individuals have different reasons why they're homeless. I nearly got stabbed by somebody who was homeless, a few months ago, right? He was having a psychotic delusion. And so it's not just sitting down and going, okay, I'm going to listen to you. What I'm talking about is listening to the structural position, asking the question of why does this whole system work? Why is Skid Row, which is very close to where I live, why is it there, right? So in the same way, it's like asking the Nazi group. You're going, why does it exist? You're listening, you're trying to figure out what is it that creates and gives rise to that group? What is it that gives rise to liberal Orientalism? What structures within society generate that and make it so powerful? So it's not that you're listening to individuals, right? Not in this political sense. You're trying to listen because you want to abolish all of those things, right? You want to get rid of supremacy, you want to get rid of Orientalism, you want to get rid of homelessness. So in different ways you want to abolish them all. And the way you abolish them all is beginning to work out how they arise structurally out of some sort of fundamental antagonism in society. And if that fundamentalism, antagonism is connected to the fantasy of an undivided other that can fully satisfy us, or that we can fully satisfy, right? Sadism and Masochism. And that is generated precisely by our inability to connect with the undivided other, right? So just as sadism and masochism is precisely generated by failure, right? Then our contemporary society, where we're always promised wholeness and completeness, but never get it. Most of us never will get to the point of financial stability or fame or whatever it is that we would want, that we think would bring satisfaction. That's precisely what continues the fundamental fantasy. That's what actually fuels it. And for those people who have the stuff in society, the only way that they are able to maintain it is to imagine it being taken away from them. It's almost if you imagine a kid, and you've got a kid who has a toy, right? And they're just playing with the toy until there's a threat that the toy is going to be taken away. As soon as the threat that the toy is going to be taken away comes in, now they really, really want it. Now they're really, really connected to it. So it's only when their anxiety is fueled, is exacerbated, that something's going to be taken away from them, that becomes a sacred object, an object that they must hold on to at all costs. And then consequently, a child that doesn't have a toy, their anxiety can be generated when they watch another child playing with a toy, and the more they can't have it, the more the anxiety kind of arises within them, and the more the object becomes a sacred object that they must have. And both of those are generated by, one is a fear of loss and the other is loss itself. Now all of this is just kind of like my kind of thoughts. I haven't kind of, just kind of talking informally to all of you. But the concern for me is that we are seeing the predominant ideology as a perverse one. So the predominant, and I think that's why she's called his two documentaries, The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. There's something about contemporary economic life that generates perverse ideology. And the two forms of perverse ideology that are generated, that are very profoundly generated, are supremacy and Orientalism. And they are interconnected. And that's why they're talking past each other, because they're incommensurable, they're not dual organizations. And two is they are interconnected and they fuel each other because they come from the same fundamental antagonism and are generated by the same fundamental fantasy that we have to dissipate. And how do we dissipate it? Well, in parotheology, the idea is actually integrating lack, realizing there is no undivided other, getting rid of pulling the rug from the very fundamental fantasy that generates these types of racist discourses. Imagining a community in which we are able to integrate the lack and therefore overcome it. Because when you're able to integrate it, then scapegoating mechanism is overcome, and then you can see you're basically taking the entire libidinal support, the libidinal edifice that maintains these structures, you're not feeding anymore, and they begin to dissipate. And the way to do that is to set up communities that are freed from that fundamental fantasy, communities that are able to embrace the lack in ourselves and in the other, enjoy it, and ultimately overcome its negative dimensions. All right, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to see if you've got any questions or comments, and we'll see where it goes from there. Okay. Lots of hellos, first of all. Question, Kevin. So does the sadism and masochism play not also take place on a stage? There is the enjoyment of voyeurism performing for an audience. Yes, definitely. So all fantasy performs on a stage. So one way of saying what Kevin's saying, and I'm going to see if I can make a connection with what you mean, but is that our fantasies are not private, they're very public. Like, we're often fantasizing for another. Even if you think about, if you want to be rich, who do you want to be rich for, right? It's not just you want to be rich. You probably, you want to piss off your friends at school and show them your success, or you want to please your mum, or whatever it is, right? Who is the fantasy performed for? And also, more fundamentally, our fantasies are, one way of thinking about our fantasies is that they are the expressions of how we think we get the desire of the other. Right? What we really desire is the desire of the other. And when you look at someone's fantasies, sexual fantasies or other fantasies, you find out how they think they are desirable to the other. So I have to think about how to integrate that in, but Kev, that's a very good point. I think whenever you're talking about fantasy, the other thing about fantasy is designed not to be fulfilled. Right? Fantasy is always the struggle towards the thing. So fantasy is precisely a way of maintaining a distance. So the perverse structure kind of tells you something fundamental about fantasy, just in a very extreme way, because the perverse couple are the ones who never give themselves, they never get the pleasure. There's a constant pleasure in not getting. Let's see. Sorry, every time people comment it bounces, so I have to... Okay, oh yeah, Cam is saying, yeah, Cam, how's it going? Good to see you, man. I would love to hang out, see you in person. He says, and Cam always sees what I'm saying under the surface, that opposing political groups do agree about the basic issue. Both Trump, the alt-right, and Sanders, alt-left, frame the fundamental conflict as the 1% ruling elites versus 99% without power. Yes. That's a very interesting point, is that there is, but the powers, where they locate the power is very different. So, yeah, but I think, it is an interesting point you're making, which is that these different groups are isolating some sort of elite other. But what that elite other looks very different depending on which side you sit on. So you have to think about that. But that is interesting, that each, if you talk about this kind of, like, to use those terms, alt-left, alt-right, they are both potentially, they're sustained by the fantasy of a undivided other, some group, some 1%. And that's the base of conspiracy theories, is that there is an undivided other, and there's left-wing and right-wing conspiracy theories, all designed to have, there is an undivided group. The funny thing is, supremacism is kind of like where you secretly are that group, and Orientalism is, where you, I don't know. I have to think about that. That's interesting. I'll think about that and come back to it. Oh yes, Van says, could you please explain the failure in sadism and masochism? Is not quite getting that. Well, the reason why the sadist and the masochist keep obviously returning to the same fantasy is that there is a desire to. Now this is difficult, right? Because it's a complicated issue, and I'd like to do a seminar purely on this, but. You could say that what's happening in perversion is there has to be an undivided other, mother, basically an undivided subject, instantiated. There has to be a prohibition that prevents you from connecting with that complete other, and the enjoyment is in that prohibition itself. So the perverse subject in different ways is always trying to evoke the lack in the other and postulate themselves as the answer to that lack, or place themselves in some way in that narrative. So the narrative is, so if you think of a perverse religious leader who they exacerbate the lack in the congregation, that there's a problem, and they postulate themselves as the solution to that lack. And the failure, the constant failure to kind of be the answer is exactly what keeps the people in it. Now, so for example, with Joel Osteen, you've got the prosperity church where there's the promise of wealth that will fix everything or whatever. And of course, there's the failure to get it, right? So people go, why do people keep going back whenever it obviously doesn't work, right? And whenever you can statistically show that it doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera. But the psychoanalytic response is, yes, it's precisely the failure that makes people still connected to it. If it worked, you would be freed from the fantasy, right? If you went to Joel Osteen's church and you became super rich, one is that might be great, it'll pay bills or whatever, but you'll also find that being supremely wealthy in and of itself does not generate the kind of completion that you might think it does. So the very getting of the undivided thing will free you from it. It's actually the failure to get it which keeps generating the fantasy that if you did get it, it would be amazing, and hence keeps you enslaved to it. So the fundamental kind of failure then in the sadism and masochism connection is that it's precisely they enact constant failure, constant prohibition in order to keep that fantasy alive. If you're able to integrate lack and see that there is no undivided other, then that takes the libidinal satisfaction out of the fantasy. Which, by the way, on a personal level, you don't need to worry about that. We're talking structural level, is that if you want to destroy the perverse ideology of the day, you have to take the libidinal lattice that keeps it together. You have to take that away. You have to remove it, and the way to do that is communities which embrace the lack, like Alcoholics Anonymous or whatever, like a group that says that sees itself as caught up within certain problems and taking responsibility for those in a community of grace where they're accepted for who they are. That is precisely the type of community that withdraws libidinal investment in these types of ideologies. This is a funny comment. And Andy says, question, I'd like to hear more about homelessness points to the solution to a problem side. Yeah, actually, if I said that, I said it slightly wrong. It's not that homelessness points to the solution, but it is the solution. Now, it's a bad solution, but it's a solution. So there's a problem. So the prison system as well is a good example. Any country that generates a huge number of, obviously, prisoners, and predominantly from working class backgrounds, etc., that's not a problem in the sense structurally, societally, that's a solution to a problem, right? There's problems in terms of the unemployment, underemployment, lack of proper infrastructures in a given city. We list out these kind of problems, and then the solution to those problems is to have a group of people that you enslave and you put behind bars and literally get to work to create products or whatever to sell. So it's kind of like whenever you say alcoholism is the solution to a problem. Now the solution becomes its own problem. It becomes even worse than what it's the solution to. But the first thing to do with somebody who's an alcoholic is often figure out what sparks it. Like what is it in their own life that they're trying to run away from or not be part of. Now that doesn't mean that every alcoholism is kind of subjective like that. I mean, some alcoholism might be purely a biological thing. I think absolutely, but even then there's often a psychological dimension. But for a lot of people, turning to alcoholism or alcohol or drugs can be a way of avoiding a confrontation with a problem within, say, their family network or in their job. And so the alcohol provides that type of solution, but it's a solution that is its own problem that needs to be overcome by overcoming the solution. So yeah, so it's not so much, although points to as well, because you can kind of go, right, the answer is fine there. But yeah, I don't know if hopefully that clarifies it. UK man says, is this similar to the way in which a culture orients its worldview or fantasy around zero-sum narratives versus non-zero-sum narratives? That could be right. I'm just not sure 100%. I mean, so zero-sum narratives are basically there's a winner and there's a loser. A non-zero-sum basically means we can both win or both lose, right? That's what. Let's think. So when you're asking similar to the way in which, so yes, you're potentially saying that those are not commensurable. That's not a dual organization. Those are actually two fundamentally different ways of orienting society. No, that's true. Like that's again the idea of like you're looking at, this is not just people inhabiting two different positions in the same world, but looking at two different positions entirely. This is, by the way, the whole point of the proletariat is technically the class of no class, and they don't have anything commensurable with people who are within the system, because they experience are radically incommensurable worlds, and the proletariat are the ones who experience the violence of the system. So the people within the system don't experience the violence of the system, but the people on the outside of the system experience the violence of it, but there's no way in which the two of them kind of connect. And then the real is the antagonism that generates that incommensurability. Right? So, Matt says, this is good. How can a healthy monogamous relationship exist if fulfillment is impossible? We only want what we can't have and vice versa. Yeah, well, I would say that's the good news. The good news is I don't think any form of relationship works. Polyamory, monogamy, whatever, being celibate and whatever, right? That there's a lot of attempts to try to get rid of the lack. So traditionally it was monogamy, not so much now. But the interesting thing about a relationship is precisely its non-relation. So Lacan has this famous phrase, there is no sexual rapport, right? There is no sexual relation. What does that mean? Now, I have a psychoanalyst friend who says, he's Lacanian, but he says what Lacan's saying just is that there's always one person who desires more than the other. There's never a complete kind of like coalescing, and that's just kind of part of life. But I think it's actually much more radical than that Lacan means the same thing as Lévi-Strauss does, which is that the masculine and feminine, we'll take those two, not men and women, but kind of masculine, feminine structures, as in, and we'd have to get into what they are, but are different ways of mapping lack and different ways of orienting yourself to it. So there's never a yin-yang with two people, whether it's whatever configuration you have, there's never a fully commensurable unit. What you have is a failure. There's always a failure. But what you can have is a failure that you embrace and enjoy, or a failure that you try to avoid. So that means you can have definitely very healthy monogamous relationships in which the couple acknowledge the failures, enjoy the struggle of the relationship and the constant movement of it, and then also enjoy the fantasy that the other puts on them. So there's a lot of that, as a lot of people, you desire what the other desires. You don't necessarily have the same fantasy as the other, but you enjoy being desirable through the fantasy of the other. So the only unhealthy relationships, I would say, are the ones that attempt to cover over this fundamental lack and don't integrate it. And then that causes all sorts of problems. There's loads of questions. Don't know if I'll be able to get through them all. Let's see. MJK says, in society, can the concepts of prejudice or privilege be an example of the loss that is inherent, but which many try to remove, like cancer, rather than integrate and overcome? Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I think behind a lot of the discourse, and not all of it, like a lot of the funny thing is, it's it's really what animates discourses rather than the discourse themselves. But I think, yeah, a lot of the discourse today is ultimately, I think, generated by a fundamental antagonism, which, you know, I don't want to say too much about, but I think the fundamental antagonism is a precariousness and a sense of economic precariousness and anxiety over this generated by like profound inequalities, etc., and that generates Orientalism and supremacy as ways to cover over that, ways to explain it, ways to narrativize it, ways to symbolize it, that don't do very much. I mean, this is why, by the way, in psychoanalysis, diagnosis isn't that important. I had this with my analyst. I had my analyst was Bruce Fink for a year, and after my analysis, I made the mistake of writing an email to him and asking him, going like, so, in terms of your opinion, you know, in terms of diagnosis, I mean, what would you say I was kind of dealing with? And even after the analysis, he just wrote back and said, you know, like, don't think it's that important. He says you should talk about it in relation to your current analyst, because I did a year of analysis with Bruce Fink and a year of analysis with Patricia Garavici, and he says, well, work it out with her. But the idea was, oh yeah, it doesn't do any good to symbolize it, to put a name to it. That'll just make you feel better. Oh, there's a name for my craziness. The real thing is about, you know, working through it. So a lot of the narratives that we place over the central antagonism they can be useful to some extent, but not that useful. We always look for diagnoses. I have a friend who, you know, she was able to eventually kind of get a diagnosis for like autism, and she got the diagnosis, and she was really happy with it. And for about 3 or 6 months, this gave her a real sense of, I can name this thing, can name it, I can talk about it, I can put it into a box, and it became an identity for a long time, and something that was talked about online and all of that. But the problem is, you know, it's not that great a diagnosis. Like, as in, it's not that important. Like, the issue is more, what are the symptoms, and are they beneficial or are they not beneficial? And often, instead of just kind of being satisfied with, now I kind of have this box where I can understand, I don't think it's that useful a diagnostic category. They don't use it in psychoanalysis very much, right? They use it a little bit, and there's a guy called Leon, what's his surname? He just wrote a book on autism and psychoanalysis. And I've heard him lecture, and he's very, very good. But it's not a diagnostic category that's overly used, because what's important is really what looking at what are the sufferings that kind of like generate certain symptoms, and like as you look at those sufferings and as they dissipate, that's what's important. I don't know if I just went off and waffled there. I can't even remember what the question was. Sorry about that. Let's see. I'll just quickly blast through here. Couple more and I'll stop. Question, David: are people ever convinced when shown the emptiness of their fantasies actually being fulfilled? Yeah. Could this be a good political strategy or used for therapy on the individual level? That's great, David. I love that question. I was just talking about this on Sunday with the Building on Fire course, is that I would say, first of all, there's some value, right? I think philosophy has some therapeutic value. I do. And the example I used on Sunday was that if you theoretically work through this idea and become convinced philosophically and logically that reality is divided, right? So say you come to believe that, then that's kind of useful. So every now and again, when you get really depressed that there's something missing in your life, and if only you could have got up, everything would be fixed. Getting up, going for a walk, and going through the philosophy can have some therapeutic effect, yeah. But the bad news is not much. You know, it's not. Sometimes that can be enough, and sometimes that can work. But the main issue is working through it, and that's why most psychoanalysis doesn't really give much philosophical background. You don't do much of that. Some do, like existential psychotherapists, I think, do, right? There's some psychotherapists who use the work of someone like Heidegger or whatever, and I think that there's more of a dialogical or philosophical elements of that. But the reason why most psychoanalysts don't do that is because it's kind of like, no, you have to, work it through. But my thing is, so I'm kind of in the middle. I don't know what you think, David. Maybe you're in the middle like me. The reason why I love theory is because I do think it has therapeutic value, and it's easy to do. But the other is community, and community is where you kind of find liturgy, ritual, music, art, poetry that helps you kind of go through this at a more kind of almost relive the traumas in a kind of artistic way and work through them. So for me, parotheology has those two dimensions. There's transformist art and decentering practices that are the bodily rituals, and then there is the theory. And I think theory does have some therapeutic value, but for some people it does more than others. I know some people who are hyper intelligent, and often their hyper intelligence is a response to a childhood trauma. And actually, it's a type of self-cure. Whenever you meet people who are hyper-intelligent, not always, but it's a self-cure for something that they couldn't understand as when they were young. Matt says Lacan's quote was a title of my autobiography. Somebody else said there's not enough talk of S&M in theology. There was Marcella Aldous Reed. She did a lot of that. Morning Talk. Oh yes, Morning Talk. I got an email from you, didn't I? So it's a podcast. I really like the title. I don't know if I got back to you. I'm terrible at emails. I'll have to do that if I didn't, or resend the email. Feel free. How would you convince the Christian church to accept the lack if they have not by now? Is this impossible? No, that's such a good question. But it's almost like the basis of everything I do, which is partly to say that this notion of the lack is actually woven into, I think, the narrative of Christianity. It's especially up to the crucifixion, what's called kenosis, and that actually you can do a radical reading of Christianity, a parotheological reading or a radical reading of Christianity that shows that this notion of lack is actually an insight within that. And all you need is, I try to work with kind of Christian leaders, people who are writing music or speaking within those types of communities, try to kind of show how that is already there. You don't have to introduce it into it. If you have to introduce something in, it's always a problem, but it's already there and you're just kind of drawing it out, then I think it is possible. And the reason why I say it's about my work is a lot of my work is about kind of using the Christian tradition and operating from that tradition to draw out this notion of lack. And by the way, I think the only way this is going to really work is if we can have communities like this all over the world. So imagine we were starting today, right? Imagine we all agreed with this and we went, we need communities that are freed from the tyranny of happiness, certainty and satisfaction, communities where we're able to integrate the lack, etc., etc. And we go, okay, let's start. And let's move to LA, or I'll move to where you live. We'll start a community, 20 people. And then, hey, we have to be lucky that we all get on okay. And, it's going to be a bit of a hassle. And maybe in 500 years, we'll have 100 communities or whatever. Or you can find an institution that already has millions of communities all over the world, meeting every week, 3 times a week, with a whole type of structure. And then, but also has this notion kind of as a potentiality bubbling within it. Then you can spend your time drawing that out. Then you've already got an existing network that you can use. So a strategy. All right. Okay, I'll do 2 more and then stop there. Angus, at the beginning of the talk, you spoke about 2 or multiple worlds and how persons seem to be speaking past one another. Are you suggesting communication can only improve by education? No, not at all. In fact, that's the problem. Education exists at the level of the symbolic. So that's generally not going to work at all. What works is when you hit the real, which means whenever you're able to touch the central antagonism within the community that generates the different narratives, the different symbolic attempts to understand the trauma. And that means that's not it. Now, it means people doing that maybe need to be educated, right? If you're going to be obviously a political leader. I met somebody, I was in Pennsylvania, and there's this guy, he's a really nice guy, but he wanted to get into politics. And he'd never studied anything about politics, political theory, nothing, right? He wanted to be, he wanted to be the next Trump. And he was a business guy, and he was successful in his business, but really thought that politics was just going in there and kind of like, I don't know, being like a bull in a china shop and being very pragmatic, and not like spending 30 years in deep reflection and study and talk and all of that kind of thing. So that was kind of funny to me. There is a real place for education, but only for those people who say want to be leaders and trying to hit on the real. But ultimately, like in psychoanalysis, it's not an education. You don't sit in psychoanalysis and get told what your issues are. You kind of more have to experience it yourself. In fact, the analyst cultivates a conversation with yourself. So you have a conversation with your own unconscious through the analyst, who tries to kind of not be in the way of that conversation you're having with yourself. So in a similar way, there is a real important place for education, but not in terms of like changing society. For the majority of people, what it is it's about bringing to the surface the central antagonism and of robbing the central fantasy of its libidinal power. So for example, in the work that I do, I don't need to, if I have a community in LA, which I want to set up on the other side of COVID, although I'll be doing some of this teaching, majority of it will be a community where we do life together, and we sing together, and we do ritual together, and we hear talks together that are kind of designed to help us kind of live into this experience, not have to have a certain intellectual training. So yeah, 100%. Want to kind of get away from that. And then Neil. I'm a practicing analyst. Oh, very good. Okay, well now you can correct all the errors that I've made, right? Who's been thinking about the difference between racism as neurotic fantasy of having and psychotic delusion of being. Do you have any thoughts about that? That's very interesting. So the difference between racism as a neurotic fantasy of having and versus psychotic delusion of being. Do you have any thoughts about that? No, that's very interesting. Yeah, no, you are going to have to give that talk or send me an email talk. I think you're hitting on something. So psychotic. So are you kind of connecting like the neurotic kind of fantasy as being? I don't even know if it fits with the language I've been using, but that would be more like kind of Orientalism. And supremacism would be more like a psychotic delusion. So psychotic delusions, you're tyrannized by certainty. That's the person who is certain, who gets involved in conspiracy theories, all of that. The neurotic fantasy is obviously someone who is uncertain. So yeah, I don't know how to map the two. I think you probably have a better idea. I would ask you to write something, but you can write about 180 characters in this. So I don't know. I think you're right. There's probably a really interesting way to map what I've been saying onto what you're saying, but I'll avoid waffling because I don't know where that is. But if you can figure that out, let me know. Brilliant. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you so much for being part of this. I'm going to try and do more pop-ups. If you like them, let me know in the comments and I'll do more, because if you enjoy them, I'll continue to do them. I know this is a very sensitive topic. I really wanted to address it, but because you must feel it as like I do, like we're in dangerous times. I mean, every time is a dangerous time, but I just feel it. I feel it, I even feel it very emotionally, which I don't usually. I don't feel very much at all, as in things don't necessarily get inside me, but I feel the tensions, almost the too muchness. Like I've had to stop listening to certain news channels, all of that, because there's just too much. And I think we're all kind of can feel this, and I just felt that I wanted to at least begin to talk about some of this stuff, even though it's very difficult to talk about, but we can't not talk about it either. So if you have any ideas of other talks as well, or other ways I might address